Good morning, fellow faculty, students, members of the wider community, and hello and welcome. And first of all, I would like to thank the Hagen Center for making this event possible. And in particular, I would like to thank the Dean of Arts and Science, Gwen Cash James, for her support and encouragement. And briefly what this is about, we're living in extraordinary times, particularly in 2020 last year, with COVID, with lockdown, with the presidential election, with BLM, with all the events that surrounded that. And Portland, in many ways, became a central point for all of that. And central nationally, but of course, Portland's also local in the sense it's part of the Pacific Northwest. And it's a city that arguably saw more CS gas and the use of more or less lethal munitions than your average American city in 2020. And one of the sort of extraordinary features about it, or what possibly typifies it, is a press release made by Portland City Commissioner Joanne Hardesty on the 5th of September. And it began 100 days and 100 nights. That's how long Portlanders have taken to the streets. Why? And she goes on to list the reasons for that. Some of them are national, relating to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Some of them are specific to Portland, relating to the behavior of the Portland Police Bureau and the mayor and police commissioner, Ted Wheeler, and some of it relates to wider issues within Portland and to what you call the federal occupation of Portland. Now, it's part of the vocation, I suppose, of social science to try and make sense of this, try and interpret it, try and convey some understanding of it to not just students, not just within the academy, but to the wider community. And also, I think it is part of the academic vocation to encourage and nurture potential talent when you find it, whether that's in the classroom where you see a gifted and enthusiastic student with a potential future academic career and you nurture them with grades, you encourage them to go to conferences, or outside the academy when you see somebody who has got a clear potential to convey and explain and in the broadest sense educate. And Laura Jadid is one of those people because I encountered her on social media. She is her own personal story. She's a veteran. She's a graduate of, she's a poli-sci graduate, and she is an independent journalist. But I found her coverage to be insightful, to be thoughtful. She's passionate and she's engaged, but she's also completely capable of objectivity. And yes, I think this is going to be a very interesting talk. And she also just quite recently was offered a place at NYU to do a master's in journalism, and they waived the tuition fees. So I think NYU has possibly seen Laura's potential as well. So at the end of Laura's talk, we will have a question and answer session. If you have questions, put them into the chat on Facebook and we'll pick some of them for Laura to address once she's finished her talk. Thank you, and now over to Laura.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Sean. I will attempt to live up to it. Let's talk about Portland. Why Portland? Why did it rebel for 150 nights? So you may be asking a question, you should be asking a question right now, which is why is a white passing person discussing Black Lives Matter? And the answer is I'm not. Black Lives Matter is going to come up. I'm going to opine on it, but mostly this is about why Portland, of all places, became the avatar of Black Lives Matter protests over the last summer. It wasn't the place with the most property destruction. That would probably be Minneapolis or Atlanta. It wasn't the place with the most interesting or innovative protests. That would probably be Seattle and CHOP. But it is the place that went the longest and the hardest. It is the place that Donald Trump has mentioned repeatedly. It's the place that came up in the presidential debates. It's the place that Merrick Garland was asked about a few days ago by Lindsey Graham. Portland occupies a very strange space in the national consciousness, and I'm here to talk about possible reasons why. I have attended the Portland protests since May 28th, first as an activist and then pivoting to journalism in mid-June. Like anybody, I have a bias, and you should know what those biases are. I grew up far right in objectivism, which is like libertarianism on steroids, joined the military, and over the course of the last 10 years have changed my views pretty dramatically based on what I've observed. I consider myself a leftist. I consider myself a police abolitionist. And while I will be presenting facts as I saw them, whether or not they support my opinions are going to leak in there, so you should know where I'm coming from. I hope in the Q&A, if you have different opinions, you'll ask hard questions. I think it's important to talk about these things. Also, one last thing, I do curse like a sailor. I'm going to try not to curse today, but if something slips out, I ask in advance for your forgiveness. Portland has always occupied a strange spot in the national consciousness. It's got this reputation as a manic pixie dream city. It's weird, it's wacky, it's woke, it's hyper woke. For conservatives, it's this epicenter of liberal excess, just everything that's wrong with America. And for progressives and liberals, it seems like a really beautiful place. There's a reason people have been moving here in droves. If you watch the news, you may also know this city as a place that frequently has far-right protests that occasionally get violent. So we're a highly politicized place, and we're known for basically being a dark blue, very liberal, very progressive, very left-wing space. However, the history of Portland is a lot more complicated than that. And I think to understand what happened this summer, it's important to at least have a brief picture of how Oregon and Portland came to be. Oregon is, to my knowledge, the only state founded explicitly on white separatism. Founded on the eve of the Civil War, it was not a slave state. However, Black and mixed race people were not allowed to move here. They were not allowed to stay overnight here. The 14th Amendment nullified this, but the language in the state constitution did not change until the 1920s. And it wasn't until the 1940s, with the influx of workers for World War II, that this city had any significant Black population at all. It also, along with basically this entire area, the entire Pacific Northwest, bears the legacy of the migration of the 1970s, when white supremacists, such as the Aryan Nation and Posse Comitatus, moved to the Pacific Northwest because the lack of diversity they felt made it ideal for establishing a white ethno state. And this migration from the 70s to the 80s means that there is a very virulent far-right culture in the rural areas of especially Idaho, but also Oregon and Washington and parts of Montana. So what you have is, yes, Portland is very progressive, but it is surrounded on all sides by extreme far-right ideas. That's not everybody, and some people are just simply conservative, as most rural areas are, but it's important to note that this is a historical legacy of the area. Today, despite, again, the progressive reputation, Portland is the whitest city in America. Only 5.8% of the population is Black. So what you have is a progressive and white population. For our purposes, I think that matters for two reasons. One is that there's a lot of guilt among people who understand the history of this area. This feeling that it's not a good foundation, something needs to be done to fix it. More importantly, though, I think a lot of people in Portland, myself included, were less familiar with police brutality. I understood intellectually that police brutality was a problem, but I had never experienced it, which is a whole different thing. Up until May 29th, every single one of my interactions with police was positive or neutral. I never feared for my life. I was never brutalized. And it's a very different experience to go from that to being an enemy of the state. And I think that the surprise and outrage is a lot due to that in Portland. Portland also has some interesting police history. Again, despite being known as a progressive city, our police are not progressive at all. We were the place where the first police union was established, the Portland Police Association in 1942. Police associations have something of a stranglehold over policy. They often work overtime to get officers off if they commit some kind of possible crime, alleged crime. Most officers don't face punishment for that. We certainly have a legacy for that. Here's a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list. In 1985, a Black Vietnam vet named Lloyd Stevenson was killed in a chokehold. The police involved avoided any consequences. Despite being convicted, these were overturned. And in fact, nobody suffered any consequences whatsoever beyond leave with pay. The police also sold t-shirts during this time that said, "Don't choke them, smoke them." So there was no remorse for this. In 2003, Kendra James was gunned down during a traffic stop. In 2010, Aaron Campbell was killed during a welfare check. In 2017, a 17-year-old Connie Hayes was shot on his knees during an arrest with an AR-15. None of the 3 cases that I mentioned were ever prosecuted. America has a police problem, but Portland has such a big police problem that the Department of Justice came in 2012 and filed a lawsuit for excessive brutality, especially against mentally ill people. In 2014, there was a settlement that held Portland to a higher standard than they had held themselves thus far, made it so that there had to be more training and accountability. And the Portland police agreed to the terms, which they've mostly adhered to until this year. They're now out of compliance again due to the actions of the protests. So suffice it to say that Portland's police do have a legacy of brutality that rivals some of the more typical cities you'd think of for police brutality. Portland also has a robust protest culture. We are infamous for our raucous protest. George H.W. Bush gave us the nickname of Little Beirut for the reception that he received when he visited. In the 1980s, there were major battles between Nazi skinheads, or boneheads as they're known, versus anti-racist punks and skinheads. There were a lot of brawls and concerts in the streets. Eventually, the boneheads were expelled. In 2017, the first anti-fascist organization in the United States was founded in Portland, Rose City Antifa. They've been very active in the anti-fascist scene ever since. This especially became relevant in 2017 when far-right groups such as Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys began to come into Portland regularly and cause trouble. This generated new organizations on the left, such as the Youth Liberation Front, Pop Mob, and so on. The point of this is that Portland as a population is very used to showing up to protests. They have an infrastructure and organizations that are able to organize protests. So you had the groundwork for a really robust protest movement before Black Lives Matter 2020 became a thing at all. So a brief recap of the events that started all of this. I think everybody knows them, but we're just going to go over them very quickly. On May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, who knelt on his neck for over 8 minutes while his police officer buddies stood by and allowed it to happen. On May 26th, riots broke out in Minneapolis, which were met with extreme force. On May 27th, Minneapolis continued to riot. Memphis and LA also began to riot, and Portland held a very small demonstration in front of the Justice Center. A local indigenous activist led about 30 people to camp out in front of the Justice Center as a protest against police brutality. This is day 1. A lot of people think it's May 29th, it's May 27th. May 28th, the 3rd precinct burns in Minneapolis. National protests explode. If you look at the map in the bottom right corner, that's all the places that protests occurred on May 28th. In Portland, we had a completely peaceful protest in front of the Justice Center. There were approximately 100 people there. I was one of them. May 29th is where it really began. Over 1,000 people gathered in Peninsula Park, which is a historically Black neighborhood that's undergoing gentrification right now. And for hours, rally goers heard speeches from Black people who live in Portland about their experiences with police, not just the death of people they know, but brutality and unfair stops and oppression. And at the end of it, the rally marched downtown. En route, things began to get a bit hairy. The Nike building was smashed. There was a Burgerville that was broken into. They'd had some union troubles. But something I'll never forget was a Burgerville worker giving the thumbs up as protesters bashed the windows in. So things were getting very tense before they hit downtown. I remember very clearly arriving at the Justice Center that night with all of that energy and realizing before it happened that there was only one thing that made any sense given the issue and given the mood of the crowd. And sure enough, protesters broke into the Justice Center. They shattered the glass windows. They went inside. They started fires. And the police came out, dispersed the crowd with tear gas. And what followed was a night of looting, which has not been duplicated since. Protesters broke into Target. They broke into Louis Vuitton. They set Chase Bank on fire, which was a trip when I went there a month later to make a withdrawal and thought, oh, the last time I saw this building, it was ablaze. Very strange times. So that was how things began, which leads us to phase 1, which was the early days. Ted Wheeler, our mayor, whom we will discuss more later, initiated a curfew of 8:00 p.m., which was roundly ignored by everyone. There were crowds of thousands at this point. People who didn't necessarily approve of the looting very much approved of the cause and showed up to events at places like Revolution Hall, river from downtown, marching across bridges, filling the entire thing. I have not seen that many people in one place very often. The crowd at this time was mostly unified. There was disagreement on tactics, as I mentioned. There was a widespread agreement that white allies needed to step up and that this was a movement that everybody needed to participate in. These protests, especially after the curfew, were met with a lot of tear gas and a lot of brutality, or at least it seemed that way at the time. In preparation for this talk, I went back and looked at some videos that I took of what I remembered as quite a lot of tear gas. And in retrospect, it really wasn't very much. It's really quite amazing how things escalated. But at the time, people hadn't really experienced it. And so it seemed very frightening. Incidentally, not a lot of arrests. I think I just said that. But I do think that has something to do with the fact that things kept going. In Chicago, there were almost 1,300 arrests in the first 3 days of protest there, and things calmed down pretty quickly. I'm glad that didn't happen, but it's worth noting that this is something that the Portland police did, was exhibit brutality in a way that made people angry instead of deterring them. And I think that's a reason that Portland protests went on as long as they did. The protests were mostly peaceful and always nonviolent. Let's discuss that distinction real quick right now. A peaceful protest is a protest where no property damage occurs and where no illegal activity occurs. That is a completely peaceful protest. I have a friend who likes to say that a peaceful protest and a parade are basically the same thing. Your mileage may vary on that one. A nonviolent protest is a protest where no human beings are harmed. There may be property damage and there may be illegal activities. Some people equate property damage with human life. And regardless of your stance on property damage, which I accept some people in this crowd think is intolerable and unacceptable, the fact remains that a broken window and a broken human being are not the same thing. Once you start thinking about that, not only are you overvaluing windows, which can be replaced, but you are undervaluing human life in a way that I think is dangerous, and in a way that I think we saw on January 6th, where a lot of people who decried the violence of Black Lives Matter participated in actual violence against actual people. I think it's important to keep this distinction in mind. Regardless, it is the distinction that we will be using for the rest of this presentation. Protest goals. There were never unified protest goals in Portland. There was a general consensus that police brutality was an issue. There was a general consensus that something needed to be done. That is where things ended. There were basically two camps throughout the entire protest. Reformists believe that legal and policy changes can fix police brutality. They advocate for things like laws that make police wear body cams, chokehold bans, mandatory reporting, and so on, tweaks within the system to make police more accountable. These people tend to believe that abolition, which we're going to discuss in a minute, is an unrealistic, dangerous, and largely driven by white people kind of movement. Abolitionists, on the other hand, believe that police culture is toxic and it can't be reformed. They believe that its origins as slave patrols and defending property instead of people in the North, and the long, long history of racial discrimination in basically every police department in the country render it toxic enough that it needs to be disbanded and that we need to make something in its place. If you're interested in more about that, I recommend the Behind the Police podcast with Robert Evans. It's a fantastic listen, really gets into the nitty gritty of the police legacy in this country. Abolitionists want to abolish the police and replace it with organizations that help the community. There's a lot of different ways to do this, from the very utopian idea of community policing or no police to what I more subscribe to, which is the idea of specialized units that, for example, would specialize in traffic violations or mental health checks, so that you don't have one force that concentrates on violence responding to everything. Regardless, abolitionists tend to believe that reform is unrealistic and ineffective. A lot of body cam laws exist and they tend to just turn off magically when things happen. Both schools of thought do have Black and Indigenous people of color advocating for them. There is this idea that abolitionists are white anarchists, is the phrase I hear a lot. It's just not the case. The BIPOC community is not a monolith. There's a lot of different opinions. So this resulted in a tactical split. Reformists tend to like peaceful protests. Abolitionists tend to go to nonviolence. Rose City Justice was the major reformist movement. They organized peaceful marches that did not clash with police. This was by far the most popular kind of event in Portland. It started at Revolution Hall across the river, and at first they would march to the Justice Center, where people could either join the nightly protest by the more nonviolent crowd or go home. After a few days, however, the marches began to march away from the Justice Center on very, very long routes that exhausted people. And there was an impression that the group was attempting not to tolerate diversity of tactics, but to actively deter people from the nonviolent protest. Also, sometimes people would come into the Justice Center protest and try to march people away from it and away from the nonviolent protest occurring there, known as swoopers. And this was a continual problem that caused a lot of ill will. The Justice Center protests, as discussed, were nonviolent, but not always peaceful, and clashed with the police almost every night. Early suspect leaders of some of the more reformist-minded union movements set the stage for paranoia throughout the movement. There was an idea that people who didn't agree on tactics were infiltrators, were bad actors, and this dogged the protest the whole time. It was frankly a problem throughout. Which brings us to phase two, the sacred fence. The feds set up a large fence around the Justice Center on June 1st. It was very tall and it grew more robust as the protest went on, because the fence became the focal point for the protest. The police did not like people touching the fence or shaking it, and would respond with what I feel could be determined to be excessive force, such as barrages of pepper balls and tear gas. And it was real arbitrary. Some nights touching the fence would result in a lot of violence from the police, and other nights nothing happened even when the fence was taken down. And this, I think, was a radicalizing moment for a lot of people. It certainly was for me, because the idea that the police protect and serve and they're only doing what they have to do is severely undercut when they respond to the same stimulus in radically different ways, seemingly arbitrarily. It makes you think that maybe they're not really doing this to protect and serve, and that maybe they're not doing a good job of what they're doing. This was a helpful time because everyone knew what to do and where to go. Apologies. It was, nobody needed to coordinate. You just go to the fence at around 8 or 9 and see what happens. During this time, you also saw a lot of evolution of protester tactics. You saw the group learn how to march in a slow enough way that everyone could keep up. We saw the use of hand signals develop, a lot of Hong Kong tactics, like using a traffic cone to contain a tear gas munition and then pour water on it to put it out. This is a period where the protest really learned the things that it would need to keep going as long as it did. Meanwhile, the Revolution Hall marches continued until June 24th, when Rose City Justice took a hiatus amidst some fairly serious accusations of collaboration with the cops and discrimination against Black femmes. The large marches were already dwindling and they stopped completely at that point. Let's briefly talk about some tear gas, a bit of a digression here. No discussion of the Portland protest could possibly be complete without a discussion of our fine mayor, Edward Tevis Wheeler, also known as Tear Gas Teddy or War Crime Wheeler. In Portland, the mayor is the police commissioner, which is an interesting choice, which means that he has supposedly jurisdiction over police policy. Under a great deal of pressure, Wheeler issued a half-hearted tear gas ban on Twitter, which, as we all know, is the political platform of choice for 2020. What is the world? I don't know. This basically said that the police could not use tear gas unless there was a, you can see the quote, serious and immediate threat to life safety, which was up to the police to determine. While tear gas use decreased, it did not ever go away. And oftentimes the police would use tear gas and then lie about it the next day. On July 23rd, Wheeler got his. The federal agents tear gassed him. And his quote, he said that this was abhorrent and beneath us, at which time, of course, he banned tear gas forever. He didn't do that. Portland police continue to sporadically use tear gas to this day. Around during the Sacred Fence era, protest journalism evolved. And I'm just mentioning this because it's part of my story. And I think it's unusual to go from activists to journalists, and it raises some questions. So I just like to talk about why that happened. During this period, many journalists were arrested and brutalized. The risk of injury meant that a lot of the mainstream, more typical news outlets withdrew their journalists because of liability concerns. So what you had was a bunch of independent journalists on the ground who were being targeted. And as this happened, there was a movement within the community to get more citizen journalists out there to try to cover this so that people would know what was happening. And I was one of the people who felt like that was a way that I could help the movement. So that is why I began to do it. Once I did, my actions changed a great deal. I didn't chant, I didn't participate in any of the activities. I was there to document, and that's something I take pretty seriously. I think that there should be a dividing line between protesters and journalists, and it's something that I attempt to do in my work. On July 2nd, a temporary restraining order was instated by the Portland government that said German journalists could not be targeted, but were actually just allowed to be there, which changed the way people viewed press on the ground, because they went from being one of the most targeted groups to one of the least. And it caused a lot of resentment eventually, the idea that people were putting on press passes to be safer. It was bitterness towards white press profiting off of Black misery. And I'm just letting you know that those claims are out there. You can make your own decisions. It's probably not my place to comment. I'm obviously biased. On June 15th, the large fence came down and the police retreated inside, almost like they realized that they were becoming a focal point for aggression by standing there. On June 26th, the small fence came down. What this meant was that we went from having a thing that everyone knew they were going to do to not really having a focal point for the anger or a place to chant at. It also coincided with the end of Road City Justice marches, as mentioned earlier, which meant that more reformists came down to the Justice Center, and they had very different ideas about what was and wasn't acceptable for protest. This increased infighting. There were brawls at the edges of the protest. Things became very unpleasant for a while, and numbers dwindled, as you would expect. Now, this is around the time that a lot of protests were petering out. This is around the time that CHOP in Seattle went under. Things were winding down, and they would have wound down in Portland too, except they did not. We're going to just watch this while I talk a little bit. On June 1st, some federal agents were cited outside of the District Courthouse, but it wasn't until July 4th that things really kicked off. Protesters decided to launch fireworks at the District Courthouse, which I would like to point out is a brick building and was never in any danger of burning down. But they did launch fireworks against it, and the federal agents came out in force. Once this happened, the focal point became the District Courthouse. It was an oppositional thing. You can't do this to us. What you're seeing is a lot of tear gas. What you're seeing is a lot of brutality. You're seeing federal agents coming through the mist. You're seeing them menace people. In a minute, you're going to see them push people. This escalated steadily for about a month. This was a whole new level. The Portland police are brutal. The federal agents are out of control. And this is what kept the protests going. The absolute rage at national troops coming into the city to violently disperse all kinds of protests, whether they were the kind of protests that launched fireworks at a building or the kind of protests that stood around and chanted. It didn't seem to matter to them. So I've just talked about basically all of this. One thing to mention before we move on is that when they came out to defend the District Courthouse, aside from the fireworks, the only thing that had happened to the District Courthouse was graffiti. You can see that in the picture. It's a lot of graffiti, but paint has never killed anybody, and it washes off. Also, the focus shift did not happen overnight, and I don't think protesters entirely understood what bear they were poking. There was a lot of chants of "fuck Ted Wheeler." There's the cursing, but that's a quote directed at the District Courthouse. And I assure you, the Department of Homeland Security wasn't fond of Ted Wheeler either. People were not aware of what they were waking up, but they became aware. So let's talk about some of the players, because the Fed war drew out a lot of the people who had gone home before. It enraged people. The idea, again, of basically a paramilitary force coming into Portland and committing some things that we're going to talk about in a second really got the community going. One of my favorite groups was the Wall of Moms, which were a bunch of apparently suburban housewives who decided that this was unacceptable and came out. And when we first saw them, I just assumed they would get tear gas once and go home. And that is not what happened at all. They stayed for multiple gassings every night. They brought respirators. They learned to live with it. They came back together. They were champions. There was some controversy with them later when one of the members, who was white, decided to incorporate it into a nonprofit and attempt to profit off of the movement. At which time the movement split, and a wonderful Black activist named Demetria Hester took charge of the moms that I'm going to just call the awesome ones, and they continued to be a presence for a very long time. The Wall of Vets also showed up, and they weren't as big of a presence as the Wall of Moms, but I like them as a veteran myself. I think it's very cool that so many veterans understood that when we swore an oath to protect this country from enemies foreign and domestic, it meant something. And they came out often and stood in the front with shields. We got to talk about Riot Ribs, which was not a group that was on the front line, but rather one of the most amazing mutual aid things I've ever personally witnessed. It began as one man with a grill giving free food to people in the park, and expanded into basically a bodega, a mall of everything you could possibly want, from ribs to vegan food to clothing, medical supplies, you name it, they probably had it all for free. It captured the imagination of Portland, and people donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to it. It unfortunately has a sad end. There was a violent takeover of Riot Ribs in late July, and it fizzled after that. But for a minute there, it was really quite beautiful. And they needed those donations too, because the federal agents messed these guys up on the regular. They sprayed mace into the grills, they shredded tents, they destroyed donated goods. That was also a radicalizing moment for a lot of people. Because again, the idea is that the police only use violence when they have to, but Riot Ribs posed no threat to them whatsoever. That was just vengeance. It was an ugly impulse to destroy something that was helping people. And it still makes me very angry to this day. It is, to me, incomprehensible and repugnant. My absolute favorite, best for last, I wish I'd taken this picture. I hadn't. Please see the citation on the bottom. The Wall of Dads and their leaf blowers. Leaf blowers were first used in Hong Kong. It's a great tactic for tear gas because you can blow the tear gas back at whoever threw it at you. So the Wall of Dads came out, bunch of middle-aged men with leaf blowers, and when the federal agents tear gas people, they would blow the tear gas back at them. This eventually escalated into the leaf blower wars when the federal agents confiscated some of the leaf blowers and began to use them themselves. So what you had was federal agents blowing tear gas at the crowd and the Wall of Dads blowing the tear gas back at the feds in one of the most bizarre low-tech battles I have ever personally witnessed. And this is when Portland began to enter the national spotlight. People realized that some weird stuff was happening in Portland, some real scary stuff, which again, we're about to get to. And it also began to rise to the interest of our dearly departed 45th president, who began to use Portland as an example of his law and order credentials. He, in an infamous quote, said that the protest had been quelled when it certainly hadn't been quelled. The truth is, and again, can't reiterate this enough, without the federal agents, I don't believe the Portland protests would have continued past July 4th. What Donald Trump did was prolong the protests and talk about them and generate a lot of interest. It felt like the end of the world. I went through a lot of my notes to make this, and I'd forgotten how frightened I was and everyone I knew was. Every night, the force escalated. You can see in the top right, blood on the pavement, where a young man holding a boombox over his head was shot in the head with an impact munition. He lived, but he's still not okay. You had things like the snatch bans where people leaving peaceful protests or nonviolent protests or whatever, leaving, would be snatched up by unmarked vans with men in paramilitary outfits with no distinctive marking, given no due process, no paperwork, just taken, interrogated, and released in an absolutely horrifying constitutional violation. There were wild rumors that the National Guard was going to come in, that special operations, just crazy rumors all the time. And it was hard to know what to believe because things were so crazy already. People saw that the feds were carrying live ammo, and there was this question of when are they going to start shooting us? I noticed that my phone service degraded around July, that my battery was running out like a monster, and that my cell phone reception had taken a nosedive. And I was a signals intelligence specialist in the Army, so I knew what that meant immediately. In August, reporters confirmed that they had in fact been basically hoovering up everyone's data in a very, in my opinion, illegal way during these protests. It just felt like we were on the brink of civil war all the time. I was worried that I was going to die. Everyone I know that went to these protests, myself very much included, was injured during this time. I have scars that I'll bear the rest of my life from that. But eventually it ended. Kate Brown worked out a deal with Chad Wolf, the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, to make the federal agents leave Portland. Now that's in giant quotation marks. They never really left. They just withdrew back into the courthouse and stopped coming out and just egregiously hurting people every single night. And this felt like a major accomplishment to a lot of people. The press, which had swarmed during the later Fed days and just focused the national spotlight like the eye of Sauron on the city, left the city, and suddenly Portland was out of the news. And articles talked about the protests as though they were over, mission accomplished, feds expelled, we're done, right? No, it was like a sitcom. We'd gone back to where we'd started. This was not victory. There'd been no meaningful police reform. There was a loss of focus on Black lives during this period. And a lot of Black activists are angry, and I understand why. I also think that it was inevitable, because when you're in that much danger for that long, you're going to pivot to being concerned about something else. And it's unfortunate and sad that this happened. And it's something that needs to be resisted. And I believe it's important to get back to the roots of what this was about, but I don't think it's surprising that this happened. And it led to a lot of confusion and bad feelings. There was once again no focal point. There were a lot of people who believed that it was over and wanted everything to be more peaceful again. There was infighting. This is one of the periods where the brawls got really, really bad. There were mobs of feral, drunken children attacking people outside of 7-Eleven. That's a real thing that happened. And things were just very messy at the Justice Center until people decided to move away from it and start having protests elsewhere in the city. Which brings us to phase 5, the Precinct Fights, which lasted from the end of July to about mid-September. Every evening, the protesters would go to a different precinct or police building, such as the Portland Police Association building, the East Precinct, the MSCO, buildings in Portland where police work. These actions were coordinated through Twitter, Signal, and Telegram by a large variety of groups. The two that stood out for me the most were the Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front and an account called Safe PDX. It was all word of mouth. It changed every night. People would show up and basically have the same kind of protest they had at the Justice Center. The Portland police response was brutality. This is some footage I took of police just absolutely beating the crap out of somebody that was pretty clearly subdued. You'll see it in a second. Because we'd gotten a new district attorney, Mike Schmidt, who'd run on a platform of not prosecuting nonviolent protest offenses, police understood that arrests were no longer the deterrent that they used to be. So they would brutalize people and then just let them go. And the idea was definitely to get people to stop expressing their First Amendment rights. This was also the advent of the bull rush, when police would charge headlong, full sprint at protesters in the street. Press was corralled to the sidewalk, or they would be considered to be interfering with police actions and arrested. And the bull rush made it so that there was a choke point. So it was harder for press to run and film what was happening, which meant that they could brutalize people without being caught. Towards the end, they did try mass arrests. I think they understood at that point that arrests are traumatic in and of themselves. But the truth is, the police were just never as frightening as the feds. People were used to it by now, and we knew that we could do it. Everyone knew that this was possible, and it couldn't be worse than it had been in July. At this point, we're going to take a brief break from the phases of the Portland protest to discuss the phenomenon of the far right, who around this time entered into the scene. And this lasted from here basically until January 6th. So we're just going to cover it all real quick. On August 2nd, a Sunday, the first Back the Blue, Blue Lives Matter rally was held downtown by maybe 10 or 15 far-right activists. And this continued every Sunday for a very long time. They showed up armed, maybe between 10 and 30 people. It attracted anti-fascist attention. It was just constant attention. On August 15th, a far-right activist shot into a crowd that I was in. Luckily, no one was hit. He was eventually arrested, and I believe prosecution is ongoing, but it was a big moment. Suddenly, live ammunition was in play, and that was very frightening. On August 22nd, we had a major group of far-right people, probably 200 to 300, Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, QAnon people, all flavors of the far right came in. And the ensuing chaos was, well, you can see for yourself. Does this look like a riot to you? Because it looks like a riot to me. And yet the police stood by, asking everyone to remain peaceful. until the far right left, at which point they declared an unlawful assembly and dispersed the leftist protesters. And maybe I've been more angry in my life, but I can't remember when. It was such a clear statement of who they backed and who they were working for. A lot of the people who dispersed the protests were Department of Homeland Security. It felt like Trump's army. Again, the escalating tensions of this, wondering if there would be martial law, wondering how this was going to end. Would Trump win? What would happen if he won, when he had this paramilitary force that was willing to let this go on? On August 29th, Portland saw the first Trump Caravan. This is notable because a Patriot Prayer member named Jay Danielson was killed by Michael Reinl in a case that may or may not have been self-defense. I think it's murky. I'm not willing to lionize Reinl. We'll never really know if it was self-defense because a few days later, Reinl was gunned down by federal agents outside of a place he was hiding at. There was no warning. They simply murdered him. And Trump celebrated that extrajudicial murder on national TV. Again, tensions rising. Far-right activity continued, but that was strangely the high point of it. On September 7th, there was another caravan with brawls in Salem. September 26th was supposed to be a major Proud Boys event, but it fizzled out. The Back to the Blue rallies continued every Sunday. There was an incident in Salem, Oregon, Oregon's capital, where far-right protesters broke into the Capitol building in a move that presaged the January 6th insurrection. A lot of Portlanders were at that. With that out of the way, we'll return to the chronological timeline of the Black Lives Matter protest, which were finally disrupted on September 11th with the fires, which I believe anyone in the Pacific Northwest will remember the horror of those fires. Some of you had to evacuate. Some of you simply lived in areas where the air was off the charts dangerous to breathe. It was no longer safe to protest. There had been a protest every single night up until this point. On September 11th, that ended. The group pivoted to mutual aid in a really beautiful way. The community assembled donation stations across town where people who were displaced or people who were houseless and struggling could go to get clothing, medical treatment, food, whatever they needed, porta potties, whatever they needed to make it. And I think it speaks to the values of the movement that's the route they took. Which brings us to present day, phase 7, which I'm going to call winter. There are still protests in Portland, but not every day. ICE remains a popular destination, and the feds are still around. They will come out of ICE and they will tear gas the hell out of you, and they do often. But they don't happen every day, and this is not unusual for Portland. Portland has a protest season, usually about mid-June to October and November. So it's not unusual. It doesn't mean it's over. It just means that we're in a bit of a slump. All right, let's look at the results. Mayor Ted Wheeler became the first mayor in a very long time to win re-election in Portland. And I'm just going to point out some numbers without commentary, draw your own decisions. Wheeler received 166,000 votes. His main challenger, Sarah Iannarone, who ran on a pro Black Lives Matter platform, got 147,000 votes. There was also a write-in campaign for Teresa Rayford, a prominent Black activist and head of Don't Shoot Portland, which is a group that has done great work. Her write-in campaign got 47,000 votes, and I will leave you to do the math on that. Mike Schmidt became DA, not during the election, but a bit before that for esoteric reasons I won't get into. He has followed through mostly on his promise to not prosecute nonviolent protest arrests. And of course, Joe Biden won the election. And this is great, in my opinion, for the country. That's just my opinion. It has sapped liberal support for protests. And in fact, on January 20th, when people went to the ICE building, immediately there was a pivot from go get them to what are you doing? It's also removed a sense of urgency. And it's important to note that, I mean, for all the talk of anti-fascists or Black Lives Matter being Biden's army, most of them don't particularly care for Biden. And I don't think in any way that's going to dampen things next summer. Some things were accomplished. A $15 million police budget cut did occur early. That's 3% of the budget. In order to accomplish this, they disbanded the gun violence reduction team, which was unfairly, disproportionately targeted Black people. The school resource officer team and the transit police program were all disbanded. Some people will point out that homicides have gone up since those disbandment. I would point out that that was happening anyway. It's happened across the country. And it's unsurprising in this era of COVID and unrest that there would be more violence. I think it is reductive to tie that to these cuts. Happily, in November, Portland passed the police oversight program overhaul with 82% of Portland voting yes, which is an astounding number, and I think speaks to the efficacy of protests to bring these ideas to the attention of the public. It creates a new police oversight board with no law enforcement personnel on it, so it's a more unbiased organization, well, a more unbiased oversight board. This board now has the power to subpoena documents, force officers to testify, make findings public, and discipline and terminate officers. I'm going to give you a moment of silence to consider that that wasn't the case before. Obviously, the Portland Police Association immediately filed a lawsuit suggesting that this went against their contract and was a terrible idea. So it's unclear whether this is going to happen, but clearly awareness has risen. And there's also some very exciting pending legislation coming down. There's a ban on chokehold, limits on tear gas, a database of disciplinary actions on cops so that we know who the problematic cops are. There is a requirement that arrestees will receive a medical check to make sure brutalization doesn't occur. And they've created a subcommittee to research new police reform bills. Now, all of this is reformist, not abolitionist, but it's going to help people, and at least it's something. The protests weren't completely successful. Ted Wheeler was reelected. The city council is more conservative than it's ever been. There were no significant police budget cuts, and the Portland Police Association remains in nightmarish control of policy in Portland. And the police continue to be brutal. That hasn't changed. They're now out of compliance, so if anything, they're worse. Portland protests never really end. The city is taking a break, and who knows what next summer will bring? Who knows if it will be as bad? Who knows what events will happen? But Portland's always been a protest city, probably always will be. And now what you've got is a bunch of battle-hardened protesters, people ready to go to the mat for whatever it is they believe in. And I think the legacy of that's going to endure for quite a long time. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them.
Laura, you didn't just meet my expectations, you exceeded them. That would probably become the definitive account of what happened in Portland. What you need to do is write a book. Now, we have a few questions. We have too many questions, actually. I'm going to prioritize my students just because I can, and because most of the questions are from them. There's a couple of questions that are kind of a bit predictable, and you'll debunk or answer them fairly quickly. One is, and they're both from the same person, is Antifa affiliated with BLM? That's the first question. And related one, I think it's related, it's from the same person. The person asking this is also a combat veteran, actually. Why was George Floyd's death so central to Portland BLM protests, but the killing of Nathan Wallace's 7-year-old son was shot outside of his home in the South Side, Chicago area, not deemed central to Portland's BLM protests in 2020?
Those are both great questions. I'll do my best to answer them. The anti-fascist BLM link is just astoundingly good. And the answer is there's overlap, but it's not the same thing. Anti-fascists oppose fascism. They believe that police abolition is part of that. They believe that the police are part of a fascist state, and they believe that opposing police are part and parcel of anti-fascist work. Black Lives Matter protests are more focused on Black lives, making them better. There can be more reformist elements in there. The focus isn't on broad anti-fascism. It's very specifically on police brutality against Black people. And I think, again, a lot of overlap on it. Sometimes there are bad feelings. There are feelings sometimes that the anti-fascists are taking advantage of the Black Lives Matter movement to push their agenda. I don't think that's fair. I think that, the anti-fascists that I know are extremely committed to Black lives. They really do see it as part of their wider goal, but it can make things more diffuse. And so the answer to your question is that there is a difference, but there's a lot of overlap and certainly compatibility there. The question about why George Floyd, as opposed to, and I do apologize, I'm not even very aware of the murder that you're discussing. It sounds horrific. It's interesting what galvanizes people, isn't it? George Floyd isn't the first man to be killed by police in a horrific way. Eric Garner comes to mind. The thing that you cited comes to mind. Any number of things come to mind. But George Floyd captured the national attention, possibly because of timing, because of COVID, possibly because it got so much press, and possibly because of that horrible video. I don't know if there was video in the case you're citing, because again, I'm not familiar with it, but everyone could watch this man pleading for his life as he died. And I think that it really brought home to people just how unacceptable all of this was. So that would be my guess. I think Portland, like everywhere else, was deeply horrified by what we saw.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I couldn't actually fill in the detail with that particular case. If I hadn't been trying to watch two screens at the same time, I would have Googled it. So I'm not really sure. Somebody else posted some sort of an answer to it. Another question from a student, and this is, I was wondering, if you were in the police's position, what would you have done differently that would protect the community and help the police, since they need to protect lives and property differently in the different moments where they interfered? If you'd been the police, what would you have done differently?
So is that a question of what the police should have done differently, or what the protesters should have done differently?
I think it's directed at you. Literally, it says, I was wondering, if you were in the police's position, what would you have done differently that would protect the community and help the police, brackets, since they need to protect lives and property, and brackets, differently in the different moments where they interfere.
I see.
I can't imagine it was a police officer, but.
Okay, yeah, so imagining that I was in the place of the police. I mean, this is, as a police abolitionist, this is a difficult question for me, because I really do believe that the police are the wrong organization for almost anything. I do think that there needs to be a violent crime unit, because humans are terrible and they will continue to be terrible to each other until the end of time. I think that if I were the police, I would create a small violent crime unit and then disband, and create a mental health task force that's trained to respond very specifically to mental health crises in ways that don't escalate. A traffic division that's responsible just for traffic stuff. No, you don't need guns to do traffic stops, you just don't. And so on. I think that departments that can really concentrate on protecting and serving in very specific ways are important. And I think that it would protect and serve our community better than they do now, because the police don't have a great record actually of protecting people or property, for that matter.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about the figures for the US, but I happen to know the figures for Canada, that of those who have been shot by police, killed by police in Canada in last year, the year before, 70% of them had either mental health or addiction issues. So the whole question of better mental health training, all of that is central. So basically your answer is you would reform the police. That's essentially what your answer is. Another quick one, if I may, and this is from AC. Do you believe in the social contract theory, and do you believe that justifies the peaceful and nonviolent protests?
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, I'm going to have to go back in time to my political science classes. The social contract is interesting. I'm not sure. It does seem to be a thing we enter into non-consensually, but it does also seem to hold society together. I think you could argue that the police violated the social contract. The idea that they are there to protect and serve, when they cease to protect and serve, or if they never did in the first place, then that violates the contract we have with them, where they get to use force in exchange for protection. Well, if we're not getting protection, then it seems like we need to do something. And
that's a very Hobbesian answer. It's a very Hobbesian answer, in a sense that, yes, if the sovereign is there to protect us, and then the sovereign becomes a threat, the social contract is actually broken. You can make a Lockean case about it as well. It creates the justification for revolution, essentially. Okay, do you mind if I press on with one or two more?
Please.
Fantastic. Let's see. Okay, this is from actually a sociology professor in Gonzaga. In your view, how did the pandemic frame the Portland protest? For example, given the pandemic economy, including unemployed workers, did this enable the community to gather and support the protests? Related, did the middle class fear of COVID prohibit stronger middle class support for the protests?
Fantastic question. I mean, I think that nationally, COVID was a huge factor. People didn't have a lot to do. People were underemployed or unemployed. I think that made a powder keg where people were ready to explode. People were angry already. And a focal point for that anger, I think, is absolutely a factor. The poverty of it was, I think, definitely a contributing factor. And just the fact that this was something that you could do, you could actually go out and see people and feel justified in it. I think that might possibly be true with the middle class support. I couldn't say definitively. Anything I say will be speculation. I think that possibly, I mean, there was a great deal of middle class support, I think, for the nonviolent marches. So I'm actually not sure that in Portland it had a lot of deterrence. People wore masks here. People were careful. To my knowledge, there were no major COVID outbreaks during the Portland protests.
I would assume a lot of that middle class support evaporated after Biden got elected. That's
Yes.
a different point. I'll just say another couple of questions. This is from Sylvia. Martin Luther King said that riots were the language of the unheard. Knowing that, do you believe that the riots in Portland were justified? I can predict your answer to this.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I do.
Very, very simple. And another one. My question for Laura is, after another death, many injured, COVID cases increased by double or more, many people lost their jobs, properties got damaged. Were these accomplishments, was it worth that? Was what was accomplished worth that cost?
I mean, that's subjective, right? Again, to my knowledge, there were no major COVID outbreaks linked to any protests. There was certainly a lot of property destruction, millions of dollars of property destruction. I think that goes back to the social contract question. Was the violation of the social contract serious enough that people needed to bring it to the attention of people in ways that were unpleasant? I do agree with my friend that a nonviolent protest is a parade. I think that sometimes when things are unbearable for a group of people, that group is justified in making it unbearable for everyone else. That's just my opinion, though. I mean,
okay, well,
I agree.
That's we're here for your opinions and your analysis of this. Let's see. One more. Do you think that if the Portland protesters stayed civil, if they would have been heard, or did they feel the need to act out in force, since if not, nothing would have changed? That's the kind of nonviolent distinction there, I think.
It's a great question. And I think the answer is that the nonviolent protests did keep it in the news. The first few days, the major marches from Revolution Hall absolutely made the news. There were some great photo ops. You have these drone pictures of the Burnside Bridge full of people. But after a while, that's not really a front page news story any longer. It's just people marching around. And the news focused on the nonviolent protests for a reason, I believe. It made headlines. And that's just the way it goes.
As you say, much of the mainstream media was a little bit too cautious, shall we say, to wade into the tear gas and do what the independent journalists actually did. And just a follow-up question from that sociology professor in Gonzaga. The police are protecting and serving, but at the class level, sorry, it's a comment on somebody else says. Here's the thing, here's a question. Mayor Ted Wheeler, who is also, as you say, and it's an unusual situation, he's also chief of police in Portland. I believe he's also parks commissioner or something as well. All of the power centered in the mayor of Portland. But poor Ted Wheeler, he's a leftist liberal Democrat. He's gay. He is the spirit of Portlandia. And a sort of a related question, if I can find it. Is it possible that Rayford's write-in campaign cost re-elected in the mayoral campaign, actually re-elected Ted Wheeler?
I mean,
could we arrive at that conclusion?
Yeah.
As I know that's a sort of hot topic
in
certain quarters as to whether.
People aren't going to love that I brought that up, but you can do the math on it. And if people feel like it was worth it, then that's their call. I think that we could have had, I'm a pragmatist. I vote pragmatically. I voted for Anna Roan. I would do it again. I think that results matter. But people sometimes vote for ideological reasons, and I understand why they voted for Rayford. She represented a moment in time. She is a fantastic activist. I have absolutely nothing to say badly, but you can do the math. I mean, the numbers don't lie. That is what happened. So. Yeah,
I know it's a sensitive,
yes,
much debated topic. Listen. It's 11:29. Our hour of fun is almost over. Thank you so much for doing this. I thought you were going to be good, but I think you were actually excellent. And I'm going to sort of now have to look at questions, particularly from my students, to see which was the best one, because I've got to give them extra credit for it. Laura? Fantastic. Go do your master's in NYU. Write a book on this, write a book. This is going to be the definitive account. Write a book on this. And I'm sure we'll hear more from you. And also, if anybody wants to follow Laura, she's on Twitter at Laura Jadid, and she's also on YouTube, where she's doing a critique of Andy Ngo's book on Antifa at the moment. Okay, people, thank you all for watching us. Have a lovely day. And for my students, see you tomorrow. For the rest of you, see you whenever. Bye-bye, Laura. Thanks a lot.
I thank you. It was an honor. Thank you.
How do I end this thing? This is where my incompetence is coming in.